Hello and welcome back to Friday Night Games. I'm your host, JComX. Today we're kicking off a new series of videos that I'm super excited about. But first I've got to do something special. Haha, that's right! I'm a Game&Watch bitch! This is going to be a series of mini episodes about the Game&Watch. Let's do this! So what is a Game&Watch? Well, many of you will already know about the eponymous Mr. Game&Watch from Super Smash Bros. You know, the flat boy with the flippy thing and the bell ringing, he does the fire. Yeah, you know the guy. I was introduced to the concept of Game&Watches through him as well, as were many a Nintendo fan. When I first saw that big round nose, I fell in love. What a fun, unique character. He was so unlike any of the other Smash Bros characters and I was so into it. But I had no idea where he was from or what he represented. His trophy description in Smash Bros was all I had. It talked about the Game&Watch series being the father of all portable liquid crystal games. Liquid crystal games, what the hell was that? It sounds awesome! And thus began my journey of learning about one of Nintendo's most significant and influential inventions in its entire history. Basically, a Game&Watch is a small, simple, portable game that can also tell the time, which is why it's called a Game&Watch. Many of them also have an alarm feature built in. They use LCDs for their graphics, and I'm gonna have to go full nerd mode to explain how they work. Aside from having a cool name, you're already familiar with many LCDs. LCDs make up screens on calculators, scales, watches, TVs, computers, and a bunch of other things. The first liquid crystal game I ever remember playing was a Shadow the Hedgehog toy for McDonald's that was very simple but fun. And who could forget spelling out boobs on a calculator? Am I right, gamers? There are different kinds of liquid crystals and they're pretty common. You even have some inside your body. Liquid crystal describes when a substance has properties not quite liquid and not quite crystalline. LCDs use a panel of these liquid crystals in conjunction with other panels called polarizers. You may have heard of them with things like polarized sunglasses, which use polarizers to filter out light. If you use two polarizers together, you can filter out various amounts of light like this. A Game&Watch screen is made of several layers. The front layer is a polarizer which filters out some light, then it's twisted by the liquid crystal in the second panel and bounces off the back layer, which is a reflector, and it passes back through like nothing happened. But when you add an electric field to the liquid crystal, the light doesn't get twisted anymore, so when it bounces off the reflector, it gets blocked by the polarizer, making it opaque. The liquid crystal panel has all of the characteristics and graphics lightly etched into it, which use tiny, nearly invisible tubes that connect to pins, and those run to the microchip on the back, which is programmed to send specific currents at specific times. That's what gives the Game&Watch its animation and gameplay. So that's how Game&Watch LCDs work, but what I think is really cool is that Game&Watches literally use the same technology as a calculator. In a calculator, each digit has 7 segments that can connect to one prong on the chip. So if you have 8 digits, for example, you have 56 segments total. The first Game&Watch ball had only 72 segments total.
Let's face it, being sick is better than being sick, but it does get a little sick. I mean, how many Laverne and Shirley reruns can a guy watch? Mom, I need some Laverne and Shirley reruns to drink. You got it, milk. It's lots of fun. It's just what the doctor ordered. Boring. Boring. Mom!
Bomb, the game by Nintendo.
Now that we've got all the nerdy tech stuff covered, it's time to talk about the other nerdy shit, like the story behind the creation of the Game&Watch. The first Game&Watch was made in 1980. That's even before Nintendo created the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet. Mr. Game&Watch is older than Mario. Originally, when Nintendo was founded in 1889, they were all about that Hanafuda card life. After World War II put the company in a slump, Disney came around in the 50s and made a deal with Nintendo to put Disney characters on their Hanafuda cards. This caused Nintendo's focus to shift more towards the children's market. At the time, president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, was trying whatever he could to diversify Nintendo's output. They dabbled in instant rice, a taxi service, and even sex hotels. In 1969, Nintendo hired a recent graduate with a degree in electronics, Gunpei Yokoi. He was in charge of maintaining Hanafuda card assembly line machines. In his free time, he had made an extendable arm to keep himself entertained, and on a visit to the factory in 1966, Hiroshi Yamauchi saw the arm and asked if Yokoi could make a retail version that Nintendo could sell for the upcoming Christmas holiday. Yokoi created the Ultra Hand, which was extremely successful and put Yokoi in charge of creating more toys for Nintendo. When Nintendo started focusing on making electronic toys and arcade games, their creative department, which included the likes of Shigeru Miyamoto, was split up and Yokoi was placed in charge of the group called Research and Development 1. The story goes that during this time, Gunpei Yokoi was riding a bullet train one day when he saw a businessman fiddling with a calculator. This gave him an idea. What if he could create an inconspicuous device, like a calculator, that could also play games? That way both kids and adults alike could enjoy it. Of course, handheld games had already existed prior to this, but they looked like this. Remember this guy? Mattel Electronic Football. Those graphics though. How'd they get the rights to use Walter Payton's exact likeness? It's cool shit and it was fun as hell, but
damn boy, he's thick.
You also had your Simons and Merlins. I mean, who could forget Merlin? Not 70s and 80s, kids. 6 games in one? Holy shit. In Japan, meanwhile, Gunpei Yokoi and a tech engineer, Satoru Okada, were working on ideas together, and they were obsessed with an LCD handheld called the MB Microvision. It was a chunky old thing that could play interchangeable games, but the games all had the same graphics and had only minor gameplay changes. Yokoi and Okada thought they might be able to do something similar, but much smaller and with only one game and better graphics. In the 80s, Nintendo had a working relationship with a company called Sharpco, known for creating the very first LCD calculator. They worked together to see if they could use calculator technology for the Game&Watch. Yokoi and Okada then got to work on the prototype, with Yokoi in charge of game design and Okada in charge of the electronics and coding. 3 others were brought onto the team after the project was already underway. Makoto Kano, a design assistant who helped with things like packaging, designing the faceplate, and things like that, and Masao Yamamoto and Takehiro Izushi, who took turns programming the software. For each game, the company would sit around a blackboard and everyone would come up with game ideas. Gunpei Yokoi would try to keep the games focused on their most appealing and core aspects and eventually approve a concept. Kano would redraw the concept on the blackboard and the group would get to work. First, they would transfer Kano's illustration to film in a dark room and create a reverse image of the original. They would then use a jigsaw to cut the images out of tinted acrylic plastic and mount the whole thing to a circuit board, lighting the images up with tiny lights used for model trains. The group described this process as an arts and crafts project, and you can see why. They would then test the games over and over again, tweaking and refining them, until Gunpei Yokoi, who was known for his notoriously high standards, would give it the green light. The group would then be involved in marketing the Game&Watches, sometimes even helping with the commercials and going to retail stores for packaging and promotion. It's inspiring for me to hear how meticulous and carefully considered each Game&Watch was. It's one thing to see a Game&Watch or hear about one, but it's another to hold one in your hands and play it, knowing how much care and attention went into all aspects of its creation. It's a really cool feeling. I also love the simplicity of the Game&Watch graphics. Each screen has very limited retail space, so each character image needed to be clear and recognizable at a glance, which is probably why they are so simple and mostly featureless. In some of the manuals, the characters are referred to as dolls or puppets, and eventually they would consolidate into the character we know as Mr. Game&Watch, who is more or less a representative amalgamation of all the nameless people in the Game&Watch games. Over the years, Mr. Game&Watch would take a turn in representing many iconic Nintendo characters, like Mario, Luigi, Donkey Kong Jr., Stanley the Bugman, and even Link from The Legend of Zelda. Incredibly, the original Game&Watch line lasted from 1980 until 1991, 11 full years. However, that was far from the end of the Game&Watch. 6 years later, Nintendo began releasing the Game&Watch Gallery games, which were collections of the classic Game&Watch games but with updated modern versions featuring Mario characters. The original Game&Watch Gallery was the first Game&Watch game I actually played. In 2001, Super Smash Bros. Melee was released, which of course introduced Mr. Game&Watch. The year after that began the e-reader series, which came bundled with a copy of Manhole for the Game Boy Advance. In 2010, Nintendo released a special reproduction version of Ball for Club Nintendo members, as well as 2 exclusive collections with a few Game&Watch games on the Nintendo DS. And as early as this year, Nintendo released a new Super Mario Bros. Collector's Edition Game&Watch which plays the NES versions of Super Mario Bros. And The Lost Levels. Beyond that, the design of the multi-screen Game&Watch games also influenced the design of future Nintendo handhelds, like the Game Boy Advance SP and the Nintendo DS and 3DS. This of course leads us to the competition. After the success of the Game&Watch, other companies jumped on the LCD game bandwagon, creating their own LCD games. The most infamous of these is Tiger Electronics, which just annihilated the market with cheap, speedily made, low-quality licensed games that seemed to be everywhere. They were able to get tons of these famous licenses like X-Men, Batman, Sonic the Hedgehog, Disney, and a ton more. Ninja Gaiden? How the fuck would you even play that? They're super shitty and confusing to play without instructions and desperately lack the love and attention to detail of the Game&Watch. Of course, many people still have a lot of nostalgia for these games, and those people are trash. It's fine. Join the club. Needless to say, the influence and legacy of the Game & Watch continues to this very day. It's incredible how important of a step the Game & Watch was towards making Nintendo the company it is today. I'm extremely excited to delve into each of the games and the different models that were produced. Next time we'll be looking at the Silver series of Game & Watches, the very first line ever produced. Stay tuned for more LCD shenanigans on Friday Night Games.